On his deathbed, Harold Gray's trembling hands gripped the hospital sheets as he summoned his estranged nephew, Daniel. His once proud voice was reduced to a whisper, but his words sent shockwaves through the room. "I destroyed your father's marriage, out of jealousy," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. The weight of a decades-old betrayal hung heavy in the air. With his final breaths, Harold handed Daniel a key and a cryptic note, setting off a chain of events no one could have foreseen. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Harold Gray lay motionless on the sterile white sheets, his once dominating presence reduced to a frail shadow of the man he used to be. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on his gaunt face, accentuating every line carved by time and regret. The air felt heavy, saturated with the unspoken tension between Harold and his nephew Daniel, who sat stiffly by his bedside, unsure why he had even come. Daniel had never been close to his uncle. Harold was a successful businessman, wealthy and respected, but his cold demeanor had always kept people at arm's length. Family gatherings were rare, and when they happened, Harold attended out of obligation rather than affection. Yet here Daniel was, summoned by the family lawyer with a vague message. Harold needed to see him, urgently. For hours Harold remained silent, his breathing labored, his sunken eyes fixated on the ceiling. Daniel, awkward and restless, scrolled through his phone to pass the time. He had questions, of course. Why him? Why now? But the answers would come sooner than he expected. "Daniel." Harold's voice cracked like a dry twig breaking underfoot. It was the first word he had spoken in hours. Daniel leaned forward, startled as Harold's trembling hand reached for his. "I need to confess something," Harold whispered, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The once proud man seemed to shrink further into the bed, consumed by the weight of his words. Daniel frowned, unsure how to respond. "Uncle Harold, maybe you should rest." "No." Harold's voice rose suddenly, surprising both of them. He coughed violently, the sound tearing through the stillness of the room. When he finally caught his breath, his voice was softer, but no less urgent. "Please, listen, I don't have much time." Reluctantly, Daniel nodded. He couldn't say no to a dying man, no matter how estranged they were. Harold's grip tightened on his hand, his bony fingers digging into Daniel's skin. I destroyed your father's marriage," Harold began, his voice trembling with a mixture of shame and relief. "I sabotaged it, out of jealousy." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Daniel pulled his hand away, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about? My parents divorced because my mom cheated, didn't she? That's what Dad always said." Harold shook his head weakly, tears spilling down his hollow cheeks. "No, it was a lie I created. Your mother, Anna, she was innocent." Daniel froze, his mind reeling. The foundation of his family's history, the story he had believed all his life, was crumbling before his eyes. "Why? Why would you do that?" Harold closed his eyes as if the act of remembering was physically painful. "Because I envied your father, Michael. He had everything I didn't. A loving wife, a happy family. He was the golden boy, always better than me. And Anna. She was—" Harold's voice broke and he let out a shuddering breath. "She was perfect. Too perfect. I couldn't stand it." Daniel felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "You destroyed their marriage because you were jealous? Do you have any idea what you've done? You ruined their lives. You ruined mine." "I know," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know, and I've carried that guilt for decades. But I couldn't die without telling you the truth." Daniel stood, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but Harold's frailty stopped him. The old man was already on the brink of death. Instead, Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "Is that all you wanted to say? That you destroyed my family out of spite?" Harold shook his head and motioned weakly toward the bedside table. "There's more. In my study, a key, and a note. They'll explain everything." Reluctantly, Daniel opened the drawer and found an ornate brass key and a folded piece of paper. The note was written in Harold's shaky handwriting. "To my study. The answers you seek are there." Before Daniel could say anything, Harold's breathing grew shallower. His eyes fluttered closed and the heart monitor's beeping slowed. A nurse rushed in, but it was too late. Harold Gray, the man who had lived a life of success but died consumed by regret, was gone. Daniel sat back down, his heart pounding in his chest. The confession hung in his mind like a dark cloud. Harold's admission had stirred something deep within him, a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange curiosity. Why had his uncle chosen this moment to reveal the truth? What else was hidden in the shadows of Harold's life? As Daniel left the hospital, the key and note clutched tightly in his hand, he felt a storm brewing inside him. The man who had torn his family apart was dead, but the truth he had revealed was just the beginning. Somewhere in Harold's study lay the answers Daniel needed, and he was determined to uncover them, no matter what he found. Every step toward Harold's mansion felt heavy, his mind racing with questions. How had Harold managed to weave such a destructive lie? What did Anna, his mother, think of all this? Daniel wasn't even sure if he was ready for the answers, but he knew he couldn't ignore them. For too long, he had lived in the shadow of a broken family. It was time to face the truth, even if it shattered him further. The drive to Harold Gray's mansion felt like a journey into another world. Daniel had been there only a handful of times as a child, each visit more uncomfortable than the last. Harold's estate was the embodiment of cold opulence. Towering gates, manicured gardens, and a sprawling house that seemed more fortress than home. As Daniel parked his car in the driveway, he felt an eerie sense of foreboding. Whatever secrets lay behind those walls, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The key felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of Harold's dying confession. Daniel took a deep breath and pushed open the front door. The house was as he remembered, silent, pristine, and utterly devoid of warmth. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming through large windows. Harold's study was on the second floor, tucked away in a corner of the mansion. As Daniel climbed the grand staircase, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The study door creaked as Daniel pushed it open. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. While the mansion felt sterile, the study was cluttered. Shelves overflowed with books, papers were scattered across the desk, and the faint smell of leather lingered. Daniel pulled the brass key from his pocket. It didn't take long to find the locked drawer in Harold's oak desk. With trembling hands, Daniel inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and the drawer slid open to reveal a box of letters, photographs, and a worn leather diary. Daniel's heart raced as he lifted the diary, its cracked cover bearing the initials H.G. He hesitated for a moment, but there was no turning back. He flipped open the diary and began to read. The entries started innocuously, detailing Harold's daily life, business dealings, social events, and musings. But as Daniel read further, the tone shifted. Harold wrote about his younger brother, Michael, with a bitterness bordering on obsession. Michael was everything Harold wasn't: charming, kind, and effortlessly successful. Harold's envy was palpable, seeping through every word on the page. And then came Anna. The first mention of her was almost reverent. Harold described her beauty, her grace, her laugh. But admiration gave way to something darker. Harold's writing became erratic, his words dripping with resentment. "She was supposed to be mine," one entry read. "He didn't deserve her." Daniel felt a chill. His uncle's obsession with his mother was unsettling. But it wasn't until he reached the entries from the year his parents' marriage fell apart that Harold's betrayal became clear. Harold had orchestrated the destruction of Michael and Anna's relationship. He detailed how he planted seeds of doubt in Michael's mind, whispering lies about Anna's fidelity. Harold even fabricated evidence, faked letters, staged photographs, all to make Michael believe Anna was unfaithful. And it worked. Michael confronted Anna in a fit of rage, accusing her of infidelity. Their marriage crumbled. Daniel slammed the diary shut, his hands shaking. The man he had grown up respecting, albeit from a distance, was a monster. Harold's actions had destroyed his parents' lives and, by extension, his own. But as furious as Daniel was, he couldn't ignore the nagging questions in his mind. Why now? Why had Harold confessed on his deathbed? And what else was he hiding? Determined to find answers, Daniel turned to the drawer's other contents. The letters were from Harold to an unknown recipient, their tone alternating between desperate and threatening. One letter in particular caught Daniel's eye. It was dated the same year as his parents' divorce and was addressed to someone named Gerald. "I can't do this alone," Harold had written. "If you don't help me, everything will fall apart. You owe me." The name Gerald rang a faint bell, but Daniel couldn't place it. He searched through the photographs next, hoping for a clue. Most of the pictures were of Harold and Michael as children, but one stood out. It was a group picture taken at a wedding. Harold and Michael were both there, along with Anna and another man, a man Daniel vaguely recognized. Could this be Gerald? Daniel tucked the photo into his pocket and closed the drawer. The study felt stifling, the air thick with the weight of Harold's secrets. As he made his way out of the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling this was only the beginning. Harold's confession had opened Pandora's box, and Daniel was determined to uncover the truth. As he drove home, Daniel's mind raced. Who was Gerald, and what role had he played in Harold's schemes? Was Anna even aware of the lengths Harold had gone to in order to ruin her life? And, most importantly, could any of this ever be set right? The answers weren't in Harold's mansion. They were out there, waiting to be found, and Daniel wouldn't rest until he uncovered them. The rain pattered against the windows as Daniel sat in his dimly lit living room, the photo of his parents' wedding, and the mysterious man named Gerald spread out before him. Sleep evaded him. Harold's confession had shattered his perception of his family, leaving him with the unsettling reality that his mother's pain had been undeserved. Gerald, the name scribbled in the letter, lingered in his thoughts, begging for answers. Daniel decided it was time to confront the other side of the story. He had not spoken to Anna in years, their relationship fractured after his parents' divorce. Now, he realized he had seen her only through his father's lens, a mother painted as a betrayer. With Harold's diary tucked into his bag, he drove to the countryside, where Anna had been living in isolation. The small cottage stood on the edge of a field, its weathered exterior reflecting the woman who had once called it home. Anna opened the door cautiously, her face lined with years of solitude and unspoken grief. She paused, unsure how to react, but eventually stepped aside, silently inviting Daniel in. "I didn't expect to see you," Anna said, her voice soft but tinged with weariness. "I didn't expect to come," Daniel admitted, "but I found something, and I think you deserve to know the truth." He placed Harold's diary on the kitchen table, its cracked cover and yellowed pages speaking of secrets long buried. Anna's expression hardened as her fingers brushed against it. "Harold," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this?" Daniel recounted Harold's dying confession, his words punctuated by the growing tension in the room. Anna listened in silence, her hands tightening as the truth unraveled. When Daniel finished, she leaned back, her eyes brimming with tears. "I knew something didn't add up," Anna said. "Your father accused me of things I couldn't even imagine doing. He wouldn't listen to me, wouldn't let me defend myself. I thought I had failed him." Anna reached for the diary and began flipping through the entries. The words written by Harold cut into her like jagged glass, each sentence a painful reminder of the life she had lost. "I always suspected Harold hated me," she murmured, "but I never thought he would go this far." Daniel hesitated before asking the question that had haunted him. "Who is Gerald?" Anna's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened. "Gerald. He was your father's best friend. But—" She trailed off, her gaze distant as if the name had unlocked a door she had long kept shut. "I always felt he was somehow involved. He was there the night your father confronted me." Anna described the night Michael had walked into their bedroom, holding the fabricated letters Harold had created. Gerald had been there earlier, supposedly to support Michael, but Anna now realized he might have delivered the evidence. "I didn't have proof, but I knew Gerald wasn't innocent," she said bitterly. "He encouraged Michael's suspicions, fanned the flames." Daniel's jaw tightened. Gerald wasn't just a bystander. He had been an accomplice. Harold might have orchestrated the plan, but Gerald had delivered the final blow to his parents' marriage. The thought made his blood boil. "Do you know where he is now?" Daniel asked. Anna shook her head. "The last I heard, he left town after the divorce. Your father never spoke about him again." The conversation left Daniel with more questions than answers. Gerald was the missing piece. If Harold's diary was to be believed, Gerald had been coerced. But why? What debt did he owe Harold that would drive him to betray his closest friend? As Daniel drove back to the city, he couldn't shake the image of his mother's tear-streaked face. For years he had seen her as the villain, but now he understood the depth of her suffering. Harold's jealousy and Gerald's complicity had robbed her of her family and dignity. Daniel vowed to find Gerald, not just for answers, but to give his mother the justice she deserved. The search for Gerald began with a call to an old acquaintance of his father, someone who might know where Gerald had disappeared. What Daniel didn't expect was the answer he received. Gerald wasn't just hiding. He was living under a new identity, his past buried beneath lies. The more Daniel uncovered, the clearer it became that Gerald's role in the destruction of his family wasn't as simple as Harold had made it seem. By the end of the week, Daniel had a name and an address. Gerald had relocated to a quiet suburb, far from the life he had once known. Standing outside the modest house, Daniel felt a mix of anger and anticipation. The man who had helped tear his family apart was just on the other side of the door. What would he say? What could he say? Taking a deep breath, Daniel raised his hand and knocked. The door opened slowly, and a man in his 60s peered out, his face pale and weathered. Gerald's eyes widened as recognition set in. "Daniel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you shouldn't be here." Daniel stepped forward, his expression hard. "We need to talk." The door shut softly behind Daniel as he followed Gerald into the dimly lit living room. The house was modest, a far cry from the opulence Gerald once surrounded himself with. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. Gerald gestured for Daniel to sit, his hands trembling as he poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on the table. "Why are you here, Daniel?" Gerald's voice was low and tired. He sat across from him, the glass of water untouched in his hands. After all these years, why now? Daniel leaned forward, the weight of his purpose pushing him past hesitation. He placed Harold's diary on the table, its cracked cover facing Gerald. "Because of this," he said, "Harold finally confessed to what he did to my parents, and you helped him." Gerald's eyes darkened as he stared at the diary, his face pale. For a moment it seemed as if he might deny everything, but then he sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of memories. "I hoped I'd never have to talk about this," he said quietly. "But I suppose you deserve to know." "Start from the beginning," Daniel said firmly. "Why did you do it? Why did you help him?" Gerald gripped the glass tightly as he began to speak. I didn't want to, he admitted. Harold, he wasn't an easy man to say no to. He always had a way of getting what he wanted. And he knew things about me. Things I couldn't afford to have come out. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What kind of things? Gerald hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. I had debts, he said finally. Gambling debts. A lot of them. Harold found out and offered to bail me out, but there was a condition. He wanted me to help him destroy Michael's marriage. I didn't know why at first, but he made it clear I didn't have a choice. The words hung in the air, heavy with betrayal. Daniel clenched his fists, struggling to keep his anger in check. So you just went along with it? You didn't stop to think about what it would do to my parents? I did, Gerald said, his voice trembling. But by the time I realized how far Harold was willing to go, it was too late. He'd already set everything in motion. All I had to do was deliver the letters he'd forged and back up his lies. I thought it would be enough to satisfy him, that he'd let it go after that. But he didn't, Daniel said bitterly. He destroyed their lives, and you helped him. Gerald flinched, his guilt written plainly across his face. I know, he said, and I've lived with that guilt every day since. I thought leaving town, starting over, I thought it would help, but it didn't. The past always catches up with you. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Gerald's confession filled in some gaps, but it didn't explain everything. Why did Harold hate my father so much? He asked. What made him so jealous? Gerald shook his head slowly. Harold was complicated. He always felt like he was living in Michael's shadow. Michael was the golden boy, the one everyone loved. Harold was successful, but it was never enough for him. And then there was Anna. Daniel's heart clenched at the mention of his mother. What about her? Gerald hesitated, as if weighing his words. Harold was obsessed with her, he said finally. He thought she should have been with him, not Michael. It consumed him. When Michael married her, it was like Harold lost the last thing he thought he deserved. The room fell silent, the enormity of Harold's resentment settling over them. Daniel's mind reeled as he tried to process everything. Harold's jealousy, Gerald's complicity, the lies that had torn his family apart. It was almost too much to bear. Is there anything else I need to know? Daniel asked, his voice tight. Gerald nodded slowly. There's one more thing, he said. Harold told me after the divorce. He never meant for it to go as far as it did. He thought Michael would forgive Anna eventually. But when Michael cut her out completely, Harold realized he'd made a mistake. He just couldn't admit it. Daniel felt a surge of anger. A mistake, he said, his voice rising. He destroyed their lives and you're calling it a mistake? I'm not excusing him, Gerald said quickly. I'm just telling you what he told me. Harold, he was a broken man, Daniel. I think a part of him hated himself as much as he hated your father. The conversation left Daniel feeling raw. He stood, his hands clenched at his sides. I can't forgive either of you for what you did, he said, his voice steady. But I needed to hear the truth. And now I need to figure out what to do with it. Gerald nodded, his expression resigned. I understand, he said. I'm sorry, Daniel. For everything. Daniel didn't respond as he walked to the door. The weight of Gerald's confession settled heavily on his shoulders as he stepped out into the cool night air. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The truth was only the beginning. What came next would define everything. The cool night air offered little solace as Daniel left Gerald's house, his mind racing with the revelations he had uncovered. Harold's jealousy, Gerald's complicity, and the lies that unraveled his parents' marriage weighed heavily on his chest. Even as anger simmered, one question burned brighter than the rest. What now? Back home, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, Harold's diary before him. The cracked leather mocked him, the secrets within leading to more questions. He flipped to one of the final entries, scanning Harold's jagged handwriting. I can't stop now. If Michael forgives her, it will undo everything. He has to believe she's guilty. I've gone too far." The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Harold's obsession wasn't just jealousy, it was madness. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that more remained hidden. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The next morning, Daniel drove to visit his father. Michael had always been a stoic man, his emotions buried beneath layers of sternness. After the divorce, he became even more closed off, and their relationship had never fully recovered. But now, Daniel realized Michael had been as much a victim as Anna. Michael's modest apartment was devoid of personality, the walls sparsely decorated. It felt like a life stripped of any reminders of the past. "Daniel," Michael said as he opened the door, his voice tinged with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Daniel said, stepping inside. He placed the diary on the coffee table. "It's about Harold and Mom." Michael's expression darkened as he sat down. "What is this?" "It's Harold's," Daniel said. "I found it after he died. He confessed everything." Michael's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "What do you mean, everything?" Daniel recounted Harold's jealousy, his obsession with Anna, and the lies he spun to destroy their marriage. He mentioned Gerald's role but softened some of the harsher details. By the time he finished, Michael's face was pale, his eyes filled with disbelief. "I always knew Harold resented me," Michael said quietly, "but I never thought he'd go this far." Daniel hesitated before asking the question that had plagued him. "Why didn't you ever question it? The letters, the photos. Didn't you think something was off?" Michael's gaze dropped to the floor. "I did," he admitted, "but Harold was convincing, and I was angry. I thought Anna had betrayed me, and I let that anger blind me. By the time I realized something didn't add up, it was too late. The damage was done." The room fell silent. Daniel felt a surge of sympathy for his father, but also frustration. How different might their lives have been if Michael had questioned Harold's lies sooner? "There's something else," Michael said suddenly. "Something I never told you." Daniel leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Michael hesitated. Finally he spoke. "After the divorce, Harold came to see me. He told me he'd made a mistake, that he lied about Anna. But I didn't believe him. I thought he was trying to manipulate me again. So I shut him out. I never told Anna because I didn't think it mattered anymore." Daniel's stomach churned. "You knew," he said, his voice rising. "You knew he lied, and you did nothing?" "I didn't know what to do," Michael shot back, frustration creeping into his tone. "What was I supposed to say? Sorry, I ruined your life because I believed my brother's lies? It wouldn't have changed anything." Daniel stood, anger bubbling to the surface. "It could have changed everything," he said. "You could have told the truth. You could have tried to fix it." Michael didn't respond, his silence a tacit admission of guilt. Daniel shook his head. "I can't do this right now," he said, grabbing the diary. "I need to think." He left without another word, his father's regretful gaze following him to the door. Outside, the crisp autumn air did little to calm his racing thoughts. Harold's lies, Gerald's complicity, Michael's silence. It all felt like a betrayal that extended beyond his parents' marriage. It had shaped his entire life. Back home, Daniel stared at the diary. He thought of Anna, living in isolation for sins she hadn't committed. He thought of Michael, trapped in guilt. And he thought of Harold, whose jealousy had set everything in motion. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The truth was out now, but what he did with it was up to him. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Daniel made a decision. He wouldn't let Harold's lies define his family any longer. The truth was only the beginning, and that meant going back to the one person who had suffered the most. Anna. But confronting Anna would not be simple. Daniel had no idea how to explain the diary, the confessions, or his own complicity in believing the lies. As he gathered the courage, one thought kept haunting him. If Harold had admitted his mistakes, why hadn't he ever tried to make things right himself? What other secrets could Harold have been hiding? Daniel knew this confrontation would reshape his family's story. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future, and whether they could ever rebuild what had been broken. The morning light filtered through Daniel's curtains, bringing with it the weight of the decision he had made the night before. He couldn't avoid it any longer. He had to face Anna, armed with the truth of Harold's diary, and finally lay bare the lies that had torn their family apart. The drive to Anna's countryside cottage felt endless, each mile closer to a confrontation Daniel wasn't sure he was ready for. The countryside was serene, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging within him. When he finally pulled into the driveway, Anna's small house looked unchanged, as if time had stood still. Anna opened the door cautiously, her face a mix of surprise and concern. "Daniel," she said softly, "what brings you here again?" "I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but tense. "There's more you need to know." She stepped aside, letting him in without a word. The living room, with its worn furniture and faint smell of lavender, did little to calm his nerves. He placed Harold's diary on the table. "I spoke to Dad," Daniel began, "and I learned something." Anna's eyes flickered with unease. Daniel recounted his conversation with Michael, sparing no details. He told her about Harold's final confession to Michael, the lies, the regrets, and Michael's failure to confront the truth. By the time he finished, Anna's hands were trembling. "He knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Michael knew Harold lied and he said nothing. He let me live with that shame for years?" Daniel nodded. "I think he was ashamed. But you deserved to know the truth, Mom. You deserved better." Anna wiped her tears, her hands trembling as she opened the diary. Each entry cut into her like a blade, reopening wounds that had never healed. When she closed it, her expression was resolute. "Thank you," she said. "I spent years wondering what I did wrong, wondering why Michael didn't trust me. Now I know it wasn't me. It was them." Daniel took her hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for believing their lies, for not coming to you sooner." Anna squeezed his hand. "It's not your fault, Daniel. You were a child. You didn't know." They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Anna spoke. "What happens now?" Daniel hesitated. "That's up to you. But I think you should talk to Dad. He's living with regret, and I think he needs to face this as much as you do." Anna nodded slowly. "You're right. It's time to stop running from the past." The following week, Daniel arranged for Anna and Michael to meet. The tension was palpable as Michael arrived, his face lined with guilt. Anna greeted him with calmness, her pain tempered by the clarity Harold's diary had given her. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had first shown Anna the diary. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I'm sorry," Michael said finally, his voice trembling, "for not trusting you, for believing Harold, for not telling you the truth. I don't know how to make up for it." Anna studied him, her expression unreadable. "You can't," she said quietly. "But you can face what you did and help me heal from it." Michael nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to make things right." Over several hours, they talked. For the first time in decades, they opened up about their pain. Michael admitted his blindness to Harold's manipulation and the guilt that consumed him. Anna spoke of her isolation and struggle to rebuild her life. Through it all, Daniel sat quietly, witnessing the first steps toward reconciliation. For Anna, it was a moment of release. "For years, I've carried this weight, thinking I wasn't enough. But Harold's lies don't own me anymore, and neither does Michael's silence. Michael nodded. I should have fought harder for you. I failed you. Anna's voice softened, though her words carried strength. You did. But we've both suffered enough. Let's not let Harold keep winning. By sunset, there was no instant forgiveness, but there was understanding. For the first time in years, there was hope. The day ended with quiet determination. Michael left with a promise, to help Anna heal and to confront his own guilt. Anna stood at the door as Daniel prepared to leave. Thank you, she said softly, for bringing the truth, even if it hurt. Daniel hugged her, feeling the unspoken weight of everything left unsaid. I'll always be here, Mom, he said. We'll get through this. As Daniel drove home, he felt a sense of closure. The wounds Harold inflicted would never fully heal, but they no longer had to define them. The truth had set them free, not from the past, but from the lies that held them captive. And as stars dotted the sky, Daniel realized something else. The story Harold had tried to control was no longer his. It belonged to the people who had survived it, the people who chose to move forward together.